Thank you. It's, I'm particularly honored to be making a presentation in front of this group this morning, or in front of the Military Museum. I hail from I guess a military family. I served in the Air Force, my brother served in the Air Force. My father was a Marine in World War II. He was in the first wave in the invasion of Okinawa, the famous Easter Sunday invasion, April 1st, 1945. I had an uncle who served with Patton's Army, and I had an uncle that didn't come home. His plane was shot down over Austria in 1943. And then he had two sisters. One of them served as an entertainer. She had a beautiful voice, and she served as an entertainer during World War II. And many a time she gave a performance where she had placed herself in harm's way. She says a lot of the times that she was performing, it was with Jeep lights coming at her. She's 96 now and living in is still feistier than hell, I'll tell you. And living in Quebec. I'd like to tell you a story about a friend today. Milo Radulovich, or history will recall him simply as Milo Radulovich. But in order to adequately tell a story, we have to go back to 1953. The war was over, but the residue remains. Few families across the country were left untouched by the war. Here in Michigan, we were starting to retool, 1953, and although the residue still hung from World War II, we were looking ahead. Here in Michigan, rationing was over. People were moving to the suburbs. There was benefit to Michigan because we were buying new cars. And when the factories work, everybody works. I'm from Flint, and we're a GM town, and I know for a fact that when the factories work, everybody works. When my father came home, he had several different jobs, but he ended up being a coach, but he also had a milk route, the retail milkman. You remember those? And he also sold other things on his milk route, potato chips, eggs, cottage cheese, and when the factories worked, he sold more potato chips, cottage cheese, etc. In perhaps one of the greatest pieces of social legislation that was ever invented, created, was the GI Bill of Rights. I went to college on the GI Bill of Rights, and I assume some in here did the same. But it wasn't all that equal. There were black soldiers who came back, and they were treated horribly. Many were still wearing their uniforms because they were proud to have served. But when a black soldier was found wearing his uniform, frequently they were attacked. There was an instance where a black soldier in Mississippi was getting on a train to go someplace else in the South. He was going to Jackson, and they told him to sit in the back. He said, don't sit here. Don't sit up front here, where all the white people are sitting. He was incensed. He says, I put my life on the line for my country, and ostensibly to fight all of the racist policies of Hitler and Mussolini, and then I come home and I'm confronted with this. They didn't let him off at his intended to stop. They let him off early, where the sheriff came out and met him, and he was severely beaten. And but the whole GI Bill was equivalent to 40 acres and a mule, because when they were developing the guidelines for it, John Rankin, representative from Mississippi, he was picked to chair the committee. He was in line to chair the committee, I should say. And he decided, being from Mississippi, he stacked his committee with all the southern representatives. And once they did, they decided the best way to handle the GI Bill was to turn it over to the states, and let the states decide. Well, racism, and here in Michigan, racism was heavily influenced some of those decisions. And while the white soldiers coming back were created, if you will, a brand new middle-class society, black soldiers were left to the inner cities. They were left to do the working on the line in the automobile factories, where their white counterparts were part of supervision and management. And that's a big deal here in Michigan. But it still is a problem, and there's a bill in Congress right now that would rectify that with some of the families. I didn't come to dwell on that. I came to dwell on incidents in 1953. Television was beginning to take over radio, and there were some famous shows that have gone down in history. Ed Sullivan, I Love Lucy, Dragnet, Jackie Gleason, Ozzie and Harriet, Groucho Marx, Superman, Strange Visitor from Another Planet, and the General Electric Theater with this questionable actor by the name of Ronald Reagan. The Academy Awards that year they were still feeling the heavy influence of the war. The best picture was from Here to Eternity. Frank Sinatra and Donna Reed were honored for their supporting roles. William Holden for Stalag 17, great movies. The Pulitzer Prize for history, or for photography that year, went to a guy by the name of Bill Gallagher from the Flint Journal. You may recall he took the picture of the hole in Adlai Stevenson's shoe. And Mr. Gallagher, I call him Mr. because I happen to know him. I'm from Flint, and he lived right next door to my uncle. And so in another venue, I wrote an article about him, and he was a fascinating guy. And when the announcement came out about the Pulitzer Prize, Adlai Stevenson was overseas, and he says, "Good job from a guy who was not holier than thou." But there was another America at this time too. It was an America that was hovered over by the Russian bear. We were at war again, but at this time the war was cold. The casualties weren't brought home in boxes like they were a few years earlier. The casualties now were shattered lives and careers based on suspicion. I remember when Herbert Philbrick came to talk at my school. He was the subject of the television series, I Led 3 Lives. And he was making his rounds. And there was this fear that had transferred itself onto our way of living. Henry David Thoreau's Walden was banned in the libraries across the country and overseas. They referred to him as socialistic. There was a growing agitation of these Negroes, as they were called then, and surely with all of the uprising that they were, surely was communist inspired. What Jackie Robinson had to endure was unconscionable and repugnant. He had, not only was, for you baseball fans, he was being pitched high and tight wherever he went. And they were throwing at him, and he even had problems with his own teammates. Until Pee Wee Reese, from Georgia, no less, put his arm around him and said, "This is my friend, this is my teammate." And that appeared to be somewhat of a turning point. 1952, the House Un-American Activities Committee came to Michigan. Coleman Young was a young union organizer at that time, and the head of the committee was J. Parnell Thomas. And Congressman Thomas was from Georgia. And Coleman, when he got up there, it's his turn to speak, his attorney, also a congressman to be, George Crockett, said to him, "Just take the fifth." And he says, "I'm not going to take the fifth." He says, "What I'm going to do is they asked me here because they want to hear what I have to say." And so the committee counsel, George Tavener, said, according to Coleman, he said he kept abusing the word Negro. He said he kept saying Negra, and he says he was abusing the word and he knew exactly what he was doing. And so finally one of the other members of the committee said, "Mr. Young, I'll have you know that if all of I garnered all of the Negro votes in my district." He said there were 111 and I got them all. And Coleman said in response, "If all of the Negroes in your district could vote, you wouldn't be here." That took guts. And but he was heavily involved in the whole movement, and he was not going to sit there and take it from the committee chairman, J. Parnell Thomas. Interesting, J. Parnell Thomas went to prison himself on a tax question. But this is where Joe McCarthy enters into it. He was overseas, he was a Marine, and he was in the Philippines, and he was better known for his poker playing than anything else. But he had an instinct that, as the saying goes, he knew what played in Peoria. He knew what would happen with the public, and when he came back, he was going to run for office, and he instinctively knew that if you're going to get elected to office, you needed to be a veteran, especially combat veteran. Well, Joe didn't see any combat at the time, but he persuaded one of his friends he was a supply officer, but he persuaded one of his friends to let him go on a bombing mission. And he put the helmet on and went down where the bombardier was, and they took a picture of him. And so he ran on the basis that he was Tail Gunner Joe. And he got into a bit of trouble because you were not supposed to be running at that time for public office. And he was conducting his whole campaign through other people within the state of Wisconsin, but he was exonerated from all of that because they were concerned that he was, and he won, and they were concerned about it. Now, before we go any farther, I think we need to acknowledge something here. First of all, there were communists in government. We had people in the Kremlin, and it was a Cold War, and there were people that ended up acknowledging that they were, Whittaker Chambers acknowledged the fact, and there's a tremendous book out about him. I guess my quarrel with all of that are the methods that were being used to unearth the purported communists in government. It was a Cold War. You remember Mad Magazine, where they had this spy versus spy type of thing? Well, that played well because that was the culture of the government. But at the head of all of this stood Joe McCarthy. He ran for the Senate in 1946, and he won. He had a rather undistinguished career while he was a senator. But he craved the public adulation. And he was a heavy drinker, he was a womanizer, he was accused of being a homosexual, and because of that, he was constantly seen with attractive women. He married a beauty contest winner from the home state of Wisconsin, a woman by the name of Jean Kerr, who worked for him. But as the country soon learned, Joe McCarthy had hit upon an issue that people was going to resonate. So in 1950, you good Republicans out there will know that Lincoln Day speeches are sacred within the Republican Party, but they also bring in a lot of money too. And so Joe McCarthy, a Republican from Wisconsin, he offered himself to the Republican National Committee, and they figured the guy's a U.S. Senator, why not? So they had this speaking engagement to the Ohio County Women's Republican organization, and they figured he could do little harm there. And so he was dispatched to West Virginia, where the Ohio County Women's Republican was, and he gave a speech. On the way to the speech, he was picked up at the airport by a former congressman by the name of Francis Love. And he said, I got two speeches here today. I could give one on housing for veterans, which was a definite need at the time, or he says I could speak on communism in government. And former Congressman Love said, people are tired of hearing about housing for veterans. Why don't you give the communist talk? So he gave the communist talk, and it was remarkably similar to a speech that Richard Nixon had given on the floor a few months earlier. And he pilfered a lot of that, but he had reporters from Washington who were, he wanted to help him out because they saw something there as far as the news story goes. And so they pilfered that speech and added a few other things. And one of the things that J. Edgar Hoover, and the two, McCarthy and Hoover, were good friends. They used to go to the racetrack together. And I'm going to leave it alone that later on we learned that Hoover was wearing dresses, and along with his one of his aides, a fellow by the name of Clyde Tolson. That's another story entirely. But McCarthy, I said before earlier that he was accused of being a homosexual as well. So he gives a speech, and they wanted to know all about the different groups that you had already. Well, Captain Perez at the time signed the paper, but he wouldn't sign the second one indicating what organizations he belonged to. He says, that's my right. I can belong to any organization that I want to. He already indicated that he wasn't a communist. So the battle cry then became, who promoted Perez? Because he was promoted from captain to major. Well, for 36 days, the country was captivated by charges back and forth, by doctored photos that attempted to establish relationships with people who were known communists, and those relationships simply wasn't there. Enter television. George Kell, the Tiger announcer, was a good friend. And that old Arkansas twang, and I asked him about it, he said, Mike, he said, for the first time in a long time, he said, I got so captivated by these hearings that my wife had to tell me it's time to go to the ballpark, George. And, but the hearings will be remembered more for the admonition of Boston attorney Joseph Welch, who was retained to represent the Army. McCarthy attacks Welch, attacks his credibility by citing that he had a young attorney in his firm by the name of Fred Fisher. Now, Joseph Welch had sat down with Roy Cohn, and we'll get to Roy Cohn in a minute. Sat down with Roy Cohn, and they established some rules. And one of them was that you stay away from Fred Fisher. Before the hearing started, the Army McCarthy hearing started, Welch sat down with the attorneys that he brought with him, and he said, lads, he says, if anybody has anything in their background, I better know it now. He said, because I do not want that anything in your background to impair what we're doing here. And Fred Fisher said, you should know I belong to the Lawyers Guild, which was considered far left of the lawyers, and said, then son, you better go home. He says, because we're not going to jeopardize our mission here because of something inadvertent in your background. Fisher left. McCarthy broke the agreement that they had. And he sat down, he was sitting very, very close to Welch, and he said, well, he said, Mr. Welch, he says, you have this attorney in your firm, a fellow by the name of Fred Fisher, and he belongs to the Lawyers Guild. And I copied down Welch's comment. Until this moment, Senator, I think I have never really gauged your cruelty or your recklessness. Fred Fisher is a young man who went to the Harvard Law School and came into my firm and starting what looks to be a brilliant career with us. Little did I dream you could be so reckless and so cruel as to do an injury to that lad. It is true, he is with Hale and Dorr, and it is true he will continue to be with Hale and Dorr. That's the law firm. It is, I regret, equally true that I fear he shall always bear a scar needlessly inflicted by you. If it were in my power to forgive you for your reckless cruelty, I would do so. I like to think I'm a gentle man, but your forgiveness will have to come from someone other than me. McCarthy tried to interrupt him. Then came the famous statement, Senator, may we not drop this? We know he belonged to the Lawyers Guild. Let us not assassinate this lad further. Senator, you've done enough. Have you no sense of decency, sir? At long last, have you no sense of shame? Now, that turned public opinion against what McCarthy was trying to do with the hearings, and people were watching this in bars, in barber shops. People had it on the radio when they were working in the shops. The whole hearing, the Army McCarthy hearings, had captivated it. They also heard, when he was done with his speech here, that it was punctuated by applause from people who were sitting in the congressional hearing room. Maybe, just maybe, things were turning against McCarthy. He stayed on the front pages of the newspapers for a long time. He courted the press. A lot of the press was against him, but he courted the press, and he said he would go after a reporter when it was public, and then he would put his arm around the reporter. At the conclusion of it, he'd walk up and he'd say, "Come on, let's go, I'll buy you a drink." And he was known for that, but he was great copy. Who would want to listen to some other person tell the story of other legislation that was going on in Congress at that time, Social Security benefits or whatever, when you could get great copy and you're a reporter and your stuff would be on the front page? And McCarthy provided that. If you needed a quote in Washington, you could go to Joe McCarthy. Well, from February 9th, 1950, the date of his speech in West Virginia, to December 2nd, 1954, when he was officially censored by Congress, by the Senate, never did McCarthy's rating or belief in his claims drop below 50%. On December 2nd, by a vote of 67 to 22, Joe McCarthy was censured. He died a couple of years later, and one of the people at his internment at the cemetery was Bobby Kennedy. Bobby Kennedy went to work for the Democrats. He was just out of the University of Virginia Law School. He went to work for the Democrats on the committee, the House Un-American Activities Committee. My personal involvement in this is I was a former speechwriter in the Michigan Senate, and I had one of the senators came up, and every time something happened on the floor of the Senate, he said, "Oh God, this is just like McCarthy all over again." Well, it really sparked my interest, and I wondered what would possess people to willingly relinquish their constitutional rights to pursue communism. Careers were destroyed by McCarthy, lives shattered, families torn apart, ostensibly in service of communism. Herb Block, as he was known, had the famous cartoon of McCarthy, and he put an "Izu" on the bottom of it, and he said, it was addressed to the Republicans, and he said, "My God," he said, "we're supposed to run on this." Well, enter Milo Radulovich in all of this. It's 1953, and people in the media were going after Edward R. Murrow and his partner and close colleague, Fred Friendly. And they were saying, "Why don't you do something about McCarthy?" you're the only one that has the flexibility rather to do this, and CBS had pretty much given Merle an open book that he could go after any issue that he wanted. Merle was a hero. He was the Walter Cronkite of his time. He famous broadcasts from World War II from London. This is London. And he would go on from there. And he had this fantastic ability to paint a picture with his words. And he was very popular, and people waited for his evening broadcast. Now it's 1953. Joseph Stalin dies. And Milo Radulovich was a young first lieutenant, and his job was in weather. He had tremendous officer evaluation reports. He was given the top secret clearance at the time, and because one of the things, he was stationed in Goose Bay, Labrador, and was giving weather to planes that were flying over Russia at the time. So he had to have a clearance. He earned a number of credits at New York University. He decides this career in weather forecasting is for him. Not the weatherman you see on television, but Milo wanted to be a meteorologist. And he figured when he got back to Michigan that his career would be enhanced if he had a degree in physics. He comes back, living in Chelsea, Michigan, and he goes to school at the University of Michigan. Now, at the time, his wife was working. She was a radio operator. Remember that hello operator? Well, she was an operator. And Milo, in addition to going to school in the demanding curriculum of physics, he was also working another job. And he describes his existence. He had 2 children at the time, as I had a book in one hand and a text, and the other hand was rocking a cradle. One day he's visited by a major and a sergeant. Military people instinctively process rank, and he was visited by these 2 people, and you assess right away how important it is by the rank that's coming to visit you. And they knocked on his door, and this moment is so seared in his memory that he remembers he was changing a diaper at the time that they came to the door. And the major spoke. There was a certain crispness in his tone, but the major was clearly uncomfortable. He said, "The Air Force is discharging you." He was in the Air Force Reserve at the time. "The Air Force is discharging you, not for anything that you did, but for the discretions of your father and your sister. According to Air Force Regulation 35-62, you are associating with people that are unsavory and are considered a threat to the government." Now, Milo's dad was anything but a subversive. The old man could barely speak English. He worked in the Hudson Motor Car Company. Sister Margaret was another story. She had protested Paul Robeson when he came to Michigan. He was a singer and an actor. And when he came to Michigan, he wanted to stay in the old Book Cadillac Hotel. He said no. And it was as much because of his color as it was his communist leanings. Margaret was amongst the group, Margaret, his sister, was amongst the group that protested around the Book Cadillac Hotel. And that was enough to put her on the list. She also had worked in the Serbian embassy in Washington, D.C. as a secretary. And they went back, they being the FBI, went back, and they knew who she had dated, exactly what her social life was like. And she was anything but docile. That's all I can say. When the men would, at that time, the men would, after dinner, they would repair to the other room and smoke their cigars and drink their brandy while the women cleaned up. It ain't that way in my house now. I don't want to say my wife smokes cigars, but anyways, Margaret refused to stay in the kitchen. She went out and she taught politics with the men. She was, long before mini skirts and burning of bras and everything, Margaret Radulovich was, as she described herself, one feisty broad. Milo had reason to believe they were really after Margaret and not him. He said, I can't imagine, he said, I've never associated with communists, but the whole McCarthy culture was coming down on him. He was going to the University of Michigan at the time, studying physics, and the head of the physics department came up to him and said, you'd be better off going someplace else. They were receiving threatening phone calls at his home, saying, we're going to get you, commies. And his brother, he had two brothers, and they were going to, at that time, a Serbian school. And the priest there was extremely upset and ended up turning informant because his two brothers would not stand for the Chetnik national anthem. They said, we're Americans, we'll stand for the Star-Spangled Banner, but not the Chetnik band, or the Chetnik national anthem. And his sister Margaret was working in Chrysler, and the priest paid her a visit. And he was up in the office there, and he paid her a visit, and he said, you like your job? She says, I love my job. He says, well, don't get too used to it. So Margaret's husband at the time was Al Fishman. When you go to work in the shop, you get 90 days before you're under union protection. He was fired after 89 days. This whole reign of terror was coming down on him and his family. So he went and he tried, he says, he goes, because he didn't have hardly any money, he went to the Judge Advocate General's office, and over at, what's the Air Force Base in Macomb County? Selfridge. He went over to Selfridge, and because he was still, he hadn't lost his reserve status yet, he goes over there and he said, I'd like to avail myself of one of your attorneys. I'm entitled to one. And a young Harvard law school lawyer came up to him and said, get a civilian attorney. He says, we've tried 18 of these cases already, and every one we've been successful at, meaning that the plaintiff in this case had not been successful. When you read this, they called it the Statement of Reasons, the charges against Milo. There were 21 of them. They were just preposterous. His father was accused of reading subversive publications, namely, if I get this right, Slobodana Rek, which translates into free expression. And no mention was ever made in there that he read Srbojan, which is Defender of the Serbs. That's strongly an anti-communist publication. The charges were absurd, but he only wanted to keep up with events that were going on back in the old country. When he first moved to the United States, he lived in Ohio in a trailer camp for a while, and he says he recalls people riding through there on horses at night, hollering, "Popovich, Radulovich, son of a bitch." That was their cry. And he was used to the whole notion of people being prejudiced against him because he was an illegal alien. He was a legal alien. But Milo decided he had three choices. He could accept the charges and resign. But his record would read, eliminated from the service in lieu of charges, where he would have been discharged with would have been dishonorably discharged. He couldn't have that. As he was interested in a career in weather. Inextricably, weather is tied to government. He never could have gotten a job. And he said, besides that, I'm not innocent. And they were coming after my family. He said, my family was everything to him. And he says, I'm not going to betray my family. He said, fine. They let it be known that if he would testify against his sister and his father, somehow the charges would just go away. And he says, I can't do that. He says, it's my sister. He says, of course I've got a close and continuing association with him. So he decided he was going to get a civilian attorney. He's in and out of law offices all over the place. Nobody wants to touch his case. Such was the climate at that time that if you were caught defending a communist, your career might as well be over. Well, he went at the request of his sister, he went down to see Ernest Goodman. I don't remember, but Ernest Goodman was this great civil rights attorney. He had the first integrated law practice in the country, along with Maurice Sugar. And Goodman told him, no, if I defend you, I'm just going to be defending another lefty. But, he says, I've got an attorney, a good friend of mine, by the name of Charles Woodson. He said, go to him, and Charles Lockwood, I'm sorry. He said, Charlie will take your case. So Milo met with him, and Lockwood told him, I'll do this under one condition, and that's you go to the press. You allow me to introduce you to some people in the press. Milo said, okay, fine. He did not court the publicity. He didn't want it. He was uncomfortable with the media, but he went. And he said, the reporter was from the Detroit News. As of then, as is now, the News was the more conservative of the two papers in Detroit, that being the Free Press and the News. The guy did an excellent story, and across the headlines was Air Force seeks to dump, government ceases to, wants to dump Air Force reservists. And reading that article in the paper was an attorney from Macomb County, Charles Sanborn. I don't know whether that's familiar or not, but he was a judge here for a number of years too. Sanborn read it, and he knew Milo from, they both went to Michigan State College at the time. Incidentally, Milo roomed at that time with Robin Roberts, who was quite a pitcher. He went on for the Phillies and is in the Hall of Fame. But he said, I'm sorry, I should have. I apologize.
It's okay.
But said, will you, I lost my train of thought here.
You're talking about the guy that he
Yeah,
to college.
Charles Sanborn. And Sanborn went and he read the paper, and that morning he was shaving. He looked into the mirror and he said to himself, he said, I'm going to offer my services because it's the right thing to do. So, with that in mind, he called. Now, he had everything to lose. He was a young lawyer trying to establish his practice. Secondly, he wanted to give back to the community, or to the state, and he was intending on running for the state legislature. And thirdly, defending a communist is no way to run for office. So, but he had everything to lose. But he said, no, it's the right and proper thing to do. So he called Charles Lockwood and he said, I'd like to be a part of your team here. Now he had another thing to lose too. He was former First Lieutenant Charles Lockwood, Ken Sanborn, and if he went there, he was going to be part of the tribunal that they had, was going to be with his boss in the military. You can kiss your good evaluation reports goodbye. He decided he would do it again because it's the right and proper thing to do. So they go to hearing. Now, military tribunals are different from any aspect of what we know of our judicial system. Military tribunals are, you're guilty until proven innocent, unlike being innocent until proven guilty. So they go and they have the hearing. It was at 0900 on September 29th, 1953. At that very moment, Joe McCarthy was emerging from St. Matthew's Church in Washington. He had just gotten married. I just find the irony there to be something. The wedding received a blessing from Pope Pius XII. He sent him a special apostolic blessing. Part of the guests for the wedding were John and Jackie Kennedy, who had recently got married themselves, Richard Nixon and Pat. And here's Milo being charged in a hearing where he has to prove his innocence. Now you can't fool GIs. And Milo arrives on the base, and GIs are hanging out the window. And they're saying, go Milo, go Milo. And they're supporting him. And he said that meant more to his morale than anything that he had encountered so far, because things had not been going well. And so they have the hearing, and the government presents its case. And it was up to Milo to prove that he was innocent. And he says, the case, they said, was based on informants, and we cannot release the informants' names. So the attorneys say, how can we cross-examine these people? This is an insult to any sense of judicial prudence that I've ever known. And so the two attorneys started working together. Lockwood would present the case for the defense, and Sanborn would plan for the appeal. But I'm not sure that there was any sort of appeal, and neither was Sanborn. So they do that, and they lose, obviously. And the comment to the press was very succinct: we lost by the contents of a closed envelope. Well, now comes Edward R. Murrow and Fred Friendly, his close partner and colleague, and the two of them are the famed newsmen from CBS. And so seared in the memory of Fred Friendly was that he was coming out of an elevator one day, and Murrow stopped him and handed him a report. He says, "This is from the Detroit News." And he says, "Fritzl," he said, Murrow was the only one that could get away with calling me that. He said, "Fritzl, I think we've got your McCarthy story." And he handed him the article in the Detroit News. Immediately, Joe Wershba, their favorite reporter, is dispatched to Michigan. And within a day, they had been looking for a case, Murrow and Friendly. And Murrow says, all the response, he says, "I'm not a priest, I'm not a rabbi, don't bring your problems to me." But all the while, he and Friendly were looking for a special case that they could use, something so egregious that it would show McCarthyism for what it is. And so that night, after doing some preliminary interviews, reporter Wershba calls back to Friendly in New York. And he said, very briefly, the words that Friendly and Murrow have been looking to hear for some time. He said, "Fred, we got our man." And during the course of interviews that Wershba was putting together the program, he would send back, there were no satellites to bounce feeds off of or anything, but he would send back reports every night. He would call. And he says, "I think you ought to know, Fred," he says, "I talked to the father." He said, in broken English, he made more sense than anybody. He said, the old man, John Radulovich, said, he wrote a letter to President Eisenhower, and they said, "Please read the letter." And he says, "I asked for nothing. I'm an old man." He says, "But don't do this to my boy." And that was felt so heavily in the CBS News Department that a picture of John Radulovich hung there for a number of years after. So believable was he. Well, Wershba also recounts another story. He said, finally, he says, when they got done filming, he filmed Margaret and he filmed Milo and the old man. He says, finally, old John Radulovich felt relaxed, and he says, come, we eat good Yugoslavian salami. And so they had a feast on Yugoslavian salami, and they drank beer. They go back to New York now, and they're putting together this program. And there's tension all over the place because they realize that this is going to be a documentary for history. As Fred Friendly told me, that he said, before documentaries were, he says, we were nothing more, and he used the term, we were nothing more than apostles of the obvious. He said, we did a story on soldiers in Korea at Christmas time. He says, but who doesn't hurt for a soldier who's away from home at Christmas time? He said, but this was a story that, he said, that needed to be done, and this was going to be the story. They operated by concept of the little picture. You don't tell the story of the world coming down on all of humanity. You tell the story of what the world coming down meant to one person. And that's what they decided, and Milo was going to be that person. As Fred Friendly confided to me, we were looking for Milo Radulovich long before we knew who Milo Radulovich was. So now they're putting together this program, and the Pentagon gets word of it. And so Friendly and Murrow are visited by a general and a major. And they sit down and they say, you're not going to do this program. And Murrow says, we most certainly are. And he says, I don't think that would be in the best interest of government. He says, I'm not interested in what you have to say about government. He said, I'm doing the program. I'm going ahead with it. Then they reminded him that his brother, Lacey, was a brigadier general in the Air Force. He says, you wouldn't want to do this to your brother. He says, what does my brother have to do with my broadcast? They said further that you were given an award a couple of years ago for your outstanding service to the military. He was reporting during World War II. And he said, what does that have to do with the injustice that you're putting onto Milo Radulovich? Now, they got up, the general left, and he said, Friendly relates this, he says, I don't think I've ever seen Murrow display quite such an appetite for a program as he did then. So, they were going ahead with it. And they put, the show goes on, and I shouldn't have used the word show because that enters into here in a minute. The program they put together goes on here, 10:30 Tuesday night, and immediately the next day, the New York Times has an article, an editorial, saying McCarthyism has gone too far because they found this case, Murrow and Friendly, they found this case that was so egregious that it portrayed what McCarthyism was all about. Now, that night of the broadcast, the people came over after, that worked in the studio there, they came over, and they were, he says, if this was a football game, they would have carried Murrow off the field on their shoulders. He said, but here he was, bathed in smoke, he was quite a smoker, and he said they were just so pleased that somebody had gone out and done this. They went across the street, oddly enough, to the Pentagon bar, and as you walked in, Murrow and Friendly were given a standing ovation. Now these are crusty news people, and they knew that they had witnessed history that night. Well, the tide slowly started turning. Joe Wershba, the reporter, says that I think it was Jim Haggerty, who was Eisenhower's press secretary at the time. He says, I think he's the one that advised Ike to do something. But on a couple of days before their next broadcast, the next show, I won't say show, Mike, Murrow was on the phone in the morning. Fred Friendly was in the shower, and his wife Ruth, Friendly's wife Ruth, comes in and says, Fred, Ed's on the phone. He says, tell him I'm in the shower, I'll call him right back. He says, it's urgent. So he says he's shaving himself right now, and Friendly comes to the phone. If you can just visualize this, two of the most prominent news people in the country, one with a towel wrapped around him with the phone in his hand, the other guy with shaving lather on his face. And Merle says, the Secretary of the Air Force wants to go on our show the next Tuesday, and he wants to absolve Milo of all of the charges against him. And so they agreed, but they were partners and they just wanted to touch base. So he goes on the air and he does this. Secretary of the Air Force says there is no reason to believe that Milo Radulovich is any form of a threat to the country. Milo is obviously delighted. But his trials don't end there. Files remain. He gets out of University of Michigan, he doesn't graduate, but his marriage is falling apart. His wife moves to California. He's heartbroken. I was intrigued by the story, and I called him. I went to see Ken Sanborn first, and I said, do you have anything that you can share with me? And he says, I won't share a thing with you until Milo approves. So I called Milo. Out in California, he's working in the weather department out there, and I call him and he says, yeah, if you're interested in writing a book. He realized that I had done my research, but he was reluctant to make any agreement over the phone. And he says, I have been burned by this a number of times. He says, the most recently was a reporter doing one of those where are they now types of articles. And he said, we sat down, and the reporter, before I got there, asked the waitress, he says, every time he takes a sip of his drink, bring him a new one. And so the reporter then had his story. Radulovich, still plagued by charges against him, and during the course of our conversation, he had 6 whiskey and waters, which I had to distinguish myself from that kind of reporting. And so I went out there, went out to Sacramento, and visited with him. And he decided he could trust me. And we talked. We didn't even talk about the case very much. And to give you some idea of what Milo was like, we're walking in old Sacramento, and he was showing off his town. And we were walking back. It was the summertime, and there was someone out there that was begging for food. And Milo reaches in his pocket, and he gives the guy a $5 bill. And he says, please, spend this on food. Don't spend it on wine. And the guy said, I agree. And Milo says, he's going to spend it on wine. He says, I don't know why I do this. But he did, and he was a compassionate individual. And anyways, now that the charges have been dropped, his trials did not end. He went to looking for a job wherever he went. He said in some cases they even had a red mark on his file. He said it was not any easier now to get a job in weather reporting than it was before. Finally, he was hired by a private weather forecasting company out in California, and later, after he had proved his worth and his job, he was hired by the government. Later in life, he came to Lansing and worked in the Capital City Airport weather forecasting office. one of the things my publisher told me is, if you want to sell books, he says, write an article about it, because they'll put at the bottom, excerpted from this, the newly book, To Strike at a King. I did that, and I wrote an article for Michigan History magazine. It was well received. But a reporter from southern part of Michigan, downriver area, wrote in a letter to the editor of the next issue coming out, and he said, this is just another example. Ranville is doing nothing but going along with the tide, and he's desecrating the memory of that great American Joe McCarthy. I mentioned that to Milo, and I said, this is great news, man. I said, we got a bit of controversy. People are going to want to buy the book. But it told me how deep he felt about the charges and the way they disrupted his life. He said, no, we have to stop right now, stop publication. Now, Milo and I had become close friends at the time, but he was genuinely concerned. And this is our first disagreement. And he said, all you want to do is sell books. He says, you've got no idea what these people are like. These people being the people in government. He said, they're going to take away my benefits. He said, I won't have any health care. I said, nobody's going to take away any of your benefits. I said, you can burn those benefits. Please don't be concerned about that. And it was a long time before he came around. I called Fred Friendly. I was so upset. And Fred says, tell him this story. Following the Radulovich broadcast, there was, a couple of months later, was the broadcast that Milo and McCarthy put together. It was telling the story of Joe McCarthy, and that particular program is considered to be one of his downfall, the pivotal point in the downfall. They just presented film and let McCarthy hang himself. They have one picture in her picking his nose and whatever, but they let McCarthy just sort of hang himself. But there was concern before they did that program. And it was a Sunday night. The program was on Tuesday morning. It was Sunday night. And Friendly says, I sensed that there was some uneasiness in our team. And so they all met at Studio 41, and Milo says, I sense that there's a problem here. He says, if anybody in this room has got something in their background, I need to know about it now. That would injure the intent of the broadcast. One guy raises his hand and he said, I think you should know my father's in a mental institution. Another guy raises his hand and says, I think you should know that we were married and our first child appeared 6 months after we were married. All these people are telling stories of their most intimate details of their life that was nobody's business. And Milo says, stop right here. He says, the terror is right here in this room. Fred Friendly says, tell him that story. And if you want me to talk to him, I'll be fine. I also enlisted the services of a congressman that I'm good friends with, Joe Schwartz. And he talked to Milo and he said, I guarantee you nobody's going to take away any benefit that you earn. Well, he calmed down, and another incident happened. The Michigan Library Association asked us to come and speak. Now, you think of librarians as these people wearing nun shoes and they're all wrapped up in Dewey Decimal Systems and everything. But that's far from the truth. Normally it's a librarian who's defending a book that he or she probably wouldn't read anyways, but they're defending it because you have a right to read that book. And so they fall all over him. We go and talk, and because they felt a certain kinship with him. Librarians are primarily women, and some of them were quite attractive. In addition to the librarians, some students came over from Wayne State University, some co-eds. Frankly, they were attractive too. And so we were leaving the Hyatt Regency in Dearborn where we gave the speech, and I said, "Hey, man, you were really expansive tonight." He said, I said, "You were fantastic." I said, "Maybe we should find another audience full of attractive women for you to talk to." It was not the time for a stupid joke. He looked up at me when he had tears in his eyes, and he said, "Michael, for the first time, I feel vindicated. First time in 43 years, I feel vindicated." I said, "Did you mean that all along you thought this was your fault?" And he said, "Yes, it had to be." He said, "My wife left me." He said, "Because of the stress that this put upon her." And he said, "Yes." He says that. And I said, "Man, I didn't realize how deep the scars were from from the case, as the family calls it." Well, we get a call one day. They called him first, which I'm happy to report, and from George Clooney. And George Clooney says, "I'm intrigued with your case." He says, "I'm making a movie called Good Night and Good Luck, and it's about Murrow's confrontation with McCarthy." And he says, "I've read enough about what Fred Friendly had to say about your case." He said that I would, Fred Friendly says, "Without the Radulovich broadcast, we never could have done the McCarthy broadcast." He says, "I'm very interested in your movie." So he invites Milo down to his house, and he says, they were going over the script. I was invited out, but I couldn't go. And pressing schedule in. Anyways, they sat down and they hammered out the movie with all of the stars of the movie there. Clooney, Jeff Daniels from Michigan, Robert Downey Jr., who played Joe Wurspa, and they sat down with all the principal actors in the movie. And Milo was feted. He was the hero there. Joe Wurspa and his wife came out. Both of them, at one time or another, had been producers for 60 Minutes. And so they all came out, and the movie was made, and it received 8 Academy Award nominations. And among them, Best Picture and also Best Actor. David Strathern, who played Murrow, Milo called me. He was so impressed, and he said, "This guy nails McCarthy." He says he's got him beautifully down. So the movie comes out. Now we hear a lot of things about celebrities, about how they're driven by their own egos and they think they're exceptional or whatever. I'm here to tell you, George Clooney is a class act. He took care of Milo wherever he went. Every place they went, it was Milo who was being feted. And they had premieres in both Los Angeles and New York. And Clooney picked up the tab for Milo, picked up his room and board, picked up his plane tickets, the price of his plane tickets. And then I have pictures of Milo having dinner with Michael Wallace and other people from CBS that were renowned. And so Clooney gets this invite from Germany, who know a little bit about demagogues, and Clooney says, I can't make it. He says, Milo, will you go in my place? So he sent him to Germany, and all of the whatever else that entails. He had a nice trip to Germany, and we got the report back that he was outstanding. So now the movie comes out. Milo Radulovich is no longer a footnote in history. People are acclaiming him all over. We stopped in Lansing one night to have just a beer and a burger between the two of us. And there were 2 or 3 strangers in the crowd, and they came up. One of them was a tow-headed kid, blonde hair. He came up with his father, and father says, Mr. Radulovich, he said, I just want my son to meet a true American hero. And so they shake hands, and Milo looked up at me again, and he said, if anybody would have told me something like this would happen, he says, I would have said that they were crazy. But now people are beginning to talk about Milo playing a more pivotal role in the demise of McCarthyism. Milo got sick. He had a stroke out in California, which ultimately claimed his life. But he didn't lose his sense of humor. I was calling out there on a daily basis, Sacramento, and I said, how you doing? And he was real poignant, made fun of my Irish heritage. He said, Michael, me lad, what's going on? I said, what's going on with you? And he said, well, he says, I've got something in my room here that every woman in the United States wishes they had. He said, I got flowers from George Clooney. When he died, CBS ran a special later on, narrated by Mike Wallace, and he was, all I can say is that if I take nothing else from this effort, is that I made the last half of his life a lot better than the first half. And so I'll leave it there. If there's any questions, I'd be more than happy to take them. But that's the story of my friend Milo Radulovich.